Okay.
Either one.
All right, perfect.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, without further ado, then the format's going to be the same as usual. So we'll be monitoring the Q&A, and thanks for your help with that, Asif, during the talk. And if you're comfortable with it, Andrew, you can take some urgent questions as we go. Otherwise, we'll just turn to those at the end and have a discussion from there. So
sounds great.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, without further ado, thank you all so much for joining this new offering in the IU Ethics, Values, and Technology series. Today, as you see, we're going to be featuring Andrew Burt, and we have our very own Professor Asif Lubin to help introduce Andrew. So without further ado, over to you, Asif, and thank you so much for doing this, to you both.
Thank you so much, Scott, and thank you, Andrew, for joining us. It's such a delight. So I'll briefly introduce Andrew. Andrew Burt is a managing partner at B&H.ai, a boutique law firm focused on AI and analytics, and chief legal officer at Immuta. Previously, Andrew served as a special advisor for policy to the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Cyber Division, where he served as lead author on the FBI's after action report for the 2014 attack on Sony, among other assignments. Andrew holds a JD from Yale Law School and a BA with first class honors from McGill University. There's a lot more I can say about him, but I'll try to keep my presentation brief to allow him to present himself. I'll just say that I know Andrew from the Information Society Project at Yale, where I heard him speak, and I'm therefore am confident that he is going to dazzle us with a really fascinating presentation.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you so much. I hope I do dazzle. Let me share my screen here. Can folks see my screen? Maybe. Okay, thumbs up. Awesome. I'm just gonna move the video here. Okay, so thank you for coming to hear me talk. It's a pleasure to be here, and obviously Saf, part of the ISP family. So today I'm going to focus on a white paper. We just published it. It's part of a digital future white paper series at Yale's ISP. The white paper is called Nowhere to Hide, the same name as this talk. I'd also note that the white paper is available on the ISP homepage, law.yale.edu/ISP for anyone interested. And I've also included a URL to the white paper here on this slide. So it all really starts with this. This snippet of code was leaked online in November. It was created by Dahua, a Chinese state-owned company, which is really a central player in the vast apparatus of surveillance technologies deployed by the Chinese government. This piece of code, likely written by just a few developers and a few data scientists over the course of a few days, performs facial recognition and assigns each face a score corresponding to race. And in this case, the code targets Uyghurs, a Muslim minority group that has been subject to really brutal ethnic targeting by the Chinese. So in particular, I want to highlight this set of characters, under 24 characters in total. This is what allows the identification of Uyghurs at a scale and a scope that really would have been previously unimaginable for any government, really at any time in human history, capable of being deployed uniformly and consistently across a country composed of 1.4 billion people, which is, I think, the population of China. And all of this in under 24 characters total. So to be clear, my point here is about much more than just the Uyghurs, although I actually think it's very important to pause for a moment just to note that their plight is, I think, in my view, one of the greatest human rights catastrophes of the 21st century. There are an estimated 1 million people currently in concentration camps. In China, the US government now describes what's happening as a genocide. So what is happening to them is deeply horrendous. I think we all have a responsibility to do what we can to stop it. There are some organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International that are doing great work on the issue. I would just highlight the Uyghur Human Rights Project as one organization that, in my view, is doing great work. But I am starting today's talk not with an example of the Uyghurs because I want to focus on China. I really believe that what's happening to them is an illustration of something much broader than what's happening in China. I think this code illustrates basically a trend that impacts all of us as we embed digital technologies into nearly every facet of our lives. To me, this code signifies, these 24 characters signify the power of digital technologies to shape and to structure our society with ease and sometimes with linguistic elegance, and always with stunning efficacy in ways that are really difficult, if not impossible, for citizens and consumers who are, busy living all of our ordinary lives to fully understand. It's small pieces of computer code, just like this, that form the backbone of entire systems, and these systems, be they public or private or both, very often unseen, they shape many of our lives in ways that are both large and small. And so that leads me to the agenda for today's talk. Namely, I want to talk about 3 specific trends related to the digitization of our everyday lives and to the broader and sometimes unseen impact of digital technologies on citizens and on consumers around the world. Each trend has its own bullet in the slide, which I'll just read out loud here. Privacy is dead, so is trust, and you're not who you think you are. And so what do I mean by digital? Anything that can be digitized. What I mean by digitized, really anything that can be represented as computer code. So when I talk about the digital transformation of our everyday lives, I'm talking about things like how our images are captured in the course of our daily lives by increasingly ubiquitous surveillance cameras that, as of 10 years ago, were capturing 4 billion hours of footage a week just in the US alone. That was a decade ago. I'm talking about how almost all of our methods of communication, from emails to text to social media and word processing, now involve at minimum the use of computers, and at maximum, the use of the protocols the internet is based upon, the IP protocols. And so I'm talking about the Internet of Things, which seeks to turn everyday objects into connected devices and to digitize their functions. So examples of the IoT range from the practical to the ludicrous. There are pacemakers that control when patients' hearts beat. By one account, every new such device implanted in the US is now directly connected to the internet. There are internet-connected cars, an estimated 64 million of them on the roads. And there are doorknobs and toilets and light bulbs and basically practically anything you can imagine. In fact, here's a challenge. I challenge everyone currently dialed in to do this. Pick a noun, any noun, and conduct an online search with that noun plus the phrase smart device. And if my experience is any guide, you will find someone somewhere selling a variant of it. I tried once smart tree just to really see if this was, if this held up under scrutiny. So if anyone can actually find a noun that someone is not trying to sell as a variant of the IoT, please join in, let me know, I'd be curious. And these trends are only growing. Estimates place the number of connected devices at over 75 billion by 2025. And so the point is that we live in a world that's increasingly digital, where the line between digital and physical itself is becoming blurred, if not totally meaningless. And this is having deep and profound impact on our daily lives. So to start with is the impact we can feel. The world is becoming more convenient for most of us. In that sense, this trend is quite positive, especially when living through something like a global pandemic. Without the digital world, we would not be here today. And in fact, it's unclear exactly what here actually means, given that this talk is virtual. But all that being said, there are also many downsides of all of these trends. The collective state of our security and our privacy is a vexing and a thorny issue. We see this with every single breach that's dominated the headlines over the past few years. In fact, I personally have found it exhausting just to stay up with the new major breach. It seems as if almost every couple of weeks, there's some new outrageous flaw that's discovered in the digital world. And we all kind of go through this collective Groundhog Day again. And so again, I want to repeat what I have here on this slide. Privacy is dead, so is trust, and you're not who you think you are. After I overview each trend, I'm going to end this talk with some concrete suggestions about what we can and should do to address each development as lawyers, as policymakers, and as citizens around the world. So let's start with the end of privacy. I co-authored an op-ed for the New York Times with Dan Geer, who I highly encourage everyone to Google and read other things he's written, not with me, but we published this article together, and we talked about the growing trend of data breaches and the resulting deterioration of our collective privacy. And I should also note, that was before we knew about things like Cambridge Analytica or Facebook's other 20+ privacy scandals from just the following year, 2018 alone, or the Marriott hack, which exposed 500 million individuals' personal information, making it one of the largest hacks in history. This was before SolarWinds. This was before the recent Microsoft attack. This was before any number of the major hacks that have occurred since then. And the essence of our argument was really that privacy, dating back to the 1890 Law Review article by future Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis and attorney Samuel Warren, privacy has been traditionally really defined as quote unquote, the right to be let alone. The right to privacy actually has a much longer history. It was brilliantly chronicled by James Whitman, a professor at Yale, in a paper titled The Two Western Cultures of Privacy, Dignity versus Liberty, that focused really on the differences between American and European continental approaches to privacy. For anyone who's not familiar with this piece, I really recommend it highly. But Warren and Brandeis's notion of privacy to be let alone, it will do for us, and I think it will do for now, because it really captures this fundamental assumption underlying all notions of privacy, mainly that there is a quantifiable difference between being observed and being identified. So that is, in the public world of observation, it's not one that we can remove ourselves from. And individuals must, in the course of all of our everyday interactions, we need to venture out into public. Strangers, and in doing so, strangers might see how we look, they might see who we're with, what we're wearing, etc. Being identified, on the other hand, is an altogether different type of activity. Identification pierces the veil, so to speak, of our anonymity. It prevents us from being left alone, and it potentially intrudes upon our sense of dignity. And I think the key point to make is that this distinction is no longer. I'm going to talk about why that is, but to put it as simply as possible, if you can be observed, you can be identified. And this is thanks to really a confluence of factors, three mainly. The first is an abundance of data. In a digitized world, everything we do generates data. The second is cheaper and faster compute power and storage, also called the cloud. And the third is new techniques for identification brought about by machine learning, also commonly referred to as AI. And so taken together, the methods, these three kind of factors, taken together, the methods for taking almost any data and rendering it identifiable keeps growing. And I'm going to walk through three examples of that. A few of my favorite examples are that are no longer private: walking, the very act of walking, writing, and keeping your cell phone turned on. So let's start with walking. This is an article, it comes from 2018. The Associated Press published a report on China's effective use of gait analysis, gait as in the way you walk, based on the way that individuals move their bodies when they walk. According to the report, the techniques in use can, now I'm going to quote, identify people from up to 50 meters, 165 feet away, even with their back turned or face covered. And this can fill a gap, the report stated, in facial recognition, which needs close-up, high-resolution images of a person's face to work. So the very act of walking in public is no longer necessarily a private one. Okay, now on to writing. Machine learning researchers have demonstrated that given a baseload of enough writing samples, the authorship of new text can actually be identified with frightening accuracy. This is one of the papers that studies this. And this is what researchers say in this paper. They write, given the increasing availability of writing samples online, our result has serious implications for anonymity and for free speech. An anonymous blogger or whistleblower may be unmasked unless they take steps to obfuscate their writing style. Okay, that was walking, writing, and now, of course, is our cell phones. So the very act of keeping a cell phone turned on creates a record of where your cell phone is over time in relation to cellular towers, and therefore where you are over time on a map. And this information can reveal incredibly sensitive details, to include not just your identification or things like your pattern of life, but it can actually reveal something as sensitive as if you are a detective investigating a crime scene late one night, as this analysis conducted by the New York Times of supposedly anonymous location data in New York, in fact, showed. And so this is not, of course, meant to be an exhaustive list. If everything we do generates data, and data at large enough volumes generates insights we can't predict, the type of insights, intimate insights that arise from our data will only grow. And critically, I think it will continue to surprise us. That is, after all, the entire value of all of these new techniques. Human minds cannot predict or sometimes even understand what machine learning models are doing when they take vast sums of data and turn that into insights. And so the question then is, what does this mean for our privacy? or to more closely mirror the language used by our legal system, what does this mean for reasonable expectations related to our privacy? In my view, it means that our expectations of privacy they have to diminish as we generate more and more data, which we seem committed to doing over time. We generate, for example, an estimated 2.5 quintillion bytes of data every day. To people who are unfamiliar with that metric, 1 quintillion is 1,000 raised to the power of 6 or 10 to the 18th power. And so my first point here today is that privacy as we've known it, privacy as it's been defended in courtrooms and conceived of in law school classrooms and thought about in the minds of consumers all around the world is no longer. We can and we should and we need to expect less and less privacy as we generate more and more data. That is simply our new reality. And so instead, what I'm going to argue is something else must rise to take this traditional notion of privacy's place, or I fear, we will be left with an irrelevant legal concept that basically fails to apply to an increasingly urgent set of rights. And so I have some suggestions for what exactly that framework should look like. And I'm going to return to that at the close of this talk. Oh, and I missed this, that they will surprise us. A very, very key point again. Okay, that was privacy. Now on to trust. I should also just note for Asaf here that I'm in present mode, and what that means is that I can't actually see the chat or my Zoom screen. So if someone has a question or someone wants to interrupt, or Asaf, you want to jump in, please feel free, just jump in directly. Otherwise, I won't be able to see what's going on. Okay, that was privacy. Now on to trust. So one of my favorite books of the last few years, and perhaps I think one of the most overlooked in the world of cybersecurity, was this one. It was published by a Norwegian academic named Olaf Lisny in 2018. And it was given the extremely non-friendly username, which I sometimes try to say with one breath. We'll see if I can do it today. The Huawei and Snowden questions: can electronic equipment from untrusted vendors, could do it, be verified? Can an untrusted vendor be build trust into electronic equipment? So this is a picture of that book here and of Olaf. And so the book really was aimed at a technical audience. It's no wonder that it didn't make a huge splash in the legal community or in the general public. Olaf, I don't think, was attempting to have that type of impact, but his conclusions are deeply impactful, I think, for every one of us today. And so I want to tell you a little bit about Olaf's story. So a few years ago, the Norwegian government basically realized that it bought almost all of its critical technology from outside of Norway, where there was a population of just over 5 million people in Norway at the time. With that type of population, it would be extremely expensive and impractical for them to make all of their critical technology internally. Think about things like the software that runs electric stations and water pumps and cellular towers. And so the government in Norway came up with a pressing national security question, which is, how could it trust the technology it was increasingly reliant upon? What could Norway actually do to verify that the software it was using was trustworthy? And that's exactly where Olaf came in. He helped look into the question for the government, first with a commission that actually culminated in this Huawei and Snowden questions book. So what was Olaf's answer after studying this issue? His conclusion was that the government simply could not verify software as trustworthy. In fact, no one can. The very nature of our current software systems, the very complexity underlying them, their supply chains and more, basically makes it impossible to detect intentionally inserted vulnerabilities into software by software makers. So to be clear, in traditional information security, we think of the adversary and the vendor as being unrelated. And instead, the question Olaf focused on was this: how do we know the people we're buying the software from haven't sabotaged it in some way? How, for example, can we prove they're not trying to surveil us through the software without our consent, or that there isn't an intentionally implanted kill switch, which might render the software unfunctional? So public examples of this type of attack are few and far between. The same year his book was published, the cover of Bloomberg Businessweek featured this highly controversial story that alleged that factories in China implanted a tiny microchip, not much bigger than a grain of rice, into the circuit boards designed for massive data centers. And this story was highly controversial, but this was alleged to have impacted almost 30 US companies, including Amazon and Apple. According to the article, I'll quote, "The chips allowed the attackers to create a stealth doorway into any network that included the altered machines." So this would be one example of the type of worry that Olaf was addressing. Another example comes from Volkswagen's so-called Dieselgate scandal, in which the automaker inserted software into its diesel cars that intentionally defrauded emissions testers. So VW's engine software looked to see if laboratory emissions testing was being conducted, in which case it would activate basically its advertised emissions controls. If someone was testing it, then it would pass the test. Otherwise, if the car was not being tested, the cars would emit up to 40 times more emissions in real world driving. And so in this way, Volkswagen, and particularly its software, fooled regulators and consumers, all of whom thought they were interacting with relatively environmentally friendly cars. So Olaf looked at basically every component of a software system, and he determined that in nearly every dimension, a vendor can hide malicious code from consumers with relative ease. I'll give you some more examples, or some of my favorite from his book. Integrated circuits are the chips that make up circuit boards. They're composed of tens of thousands of gates on semiconducting material like silicon. Adding as few as 1,341 gates to just one chip can create a backdoor into an entire system. Or as Olaf states in simpler terms, he writes, full backdoors into a system can be created with a microscopic number of additional gates on a chip. Another example he writes about involves making the malicious behavior dependent on external stimulus. So basically the malicious code is triggered by an event that is external and therefore harder to detect before the event. This is how he describes the possibility of detecting this type of vulnerability. He writes, having this external stimulus encoded on only 512 bits would yield 13.4 times 10 to the 153 power of combinations. So for comparison, the universe has existed for approximately 4 times 10 to the 17th seconds. And what that means is that if the strongest computer on Earth had started computing at the beginning of the universe, it would still not have made any visible progress on the problem of testing these combinations. So if all of our activities are increasingly reliant upon software systems, and if software systems cannot be provably free of malicious vulnerabilities, what does this mean? What are the takeaways? I would posit 3. First, I think as individuals, it means that trust is both the most central aspect of any transaction, but it is also the least quantifiable. Trust is and will become as important as the product it is that we're actually buying. And there are some companies like Apple that are already beginning to adopt to this trend. Apple has, throughout the last number of years, been publicly making trust a very core component of their brand. I think in 2018, they took out billboards at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas that said what happens on your iPhone stays on your iPhone. In the last few weeks alone, they've started rolling out a new type of like privacy nutrition label for apps in their store. So some companies, I think, are betting big that this is true, Apple being one of them. But at the same time, because trust is not quantifiable, it also means that in some senses, trust cannot exist. I think trust will be a feature that lives equally in the world of branding and imaging as in anywhere else. In that sense, trust will be illusory. Trust will be a marketing campaign. The difference between digital products that we trust and digital products that we don't will in many senses boil down to good or bad marketing. So I think more interestingly, on this second bullet, from the legal point of view, is that our ability to contract, I think, is also going to change. In fact, I think it must. When we purchase and use a software product, there's no single point in time where meeting of the minds occurs, especially as these systems become increasingly complex. That transaction takes place in ways that are new. Indeed, a group of legal researchers came up with a great term for this state. They called it a tethered economy. And in a law review article from 2019, they write, by the same name, a tethered economy, they write that as sellers blend hardware and software, as well as product and service, tethers yoke the consumer to a continuous post-transactional relationship with the seller. And now, if you add in the fact that trust is the key, and yet also the elusive factor in this continuous relationship, and we all end up having a very real problem. So here's Olaf again, I'm gonna quote from him. He writes that when we ask ourselves if a vendor can be trusted, we have to ask ourselves if we believe if the vendor will remain trustworthy for the entire lifetime of the product we're buying. And it turns out that the reverse is also true. We must ask if we trust the entire past life of the product up until now. And so trust, like privacy, is dead in the sense that traditional frameworks simply no longer apply to our current reality. We may trust, but we can no longer verify. All right, lastly is who we think we are, or our identities. I'm gonna get a bit more philosophical or psychological here, but in the past, our identities were clearly psychological constructs. They were built from our histories, our shared experience, our preferences, our self-conceptions, and more. The existentialist philosophers, for example, the 20th century, they famously put a huge amount of effort into explaining how our identities, all of our identities, were ultimately meaningless constructs. But even to the existentialist philosophers, our identities were fictions that could be believed in. They were fictions that held up in some sense to scrutiny. What we have here on the slide comes from a great Time magazine cover in 2007, basically heralding the everyday internet's user's role in shaping the internet. But the truth is that today, the idea that we can construct our own identities is a fiction that is both coming under attack, and I also think it's a fiction that is evaporating in both profound and subtle ways. Because nearly every act we undertake creates data, for many of us, our very existence creates a composite of our actions that defines us, that represents us better than any fiction ever could. I think of everything I've said today, I really think this point is among the least widely appreciated, frankly, because we as consumers see so little of the data we actually generate over time. So we don't see, for example, the minute by minute records of every time our cell phone pings a nearby tower, mapping our lives in practically real time. Cell phone companies and internet service providers see that data. We don't see our shopping histories or the intimate insights they yield, like when Target, almost a decade ago now, famously predicted a teenager was pregnant before her family even knew, based on her consumption patterns alone. Retailers compile all that data. And again, that was almost a decade ago. And of course, we don't see the hundreds of thousands of rows and tables and massive databases compiled by companies like Google and Facebook that really detail point by point everything they could possibly know about us based on all our online activities. A few years ago, a data consultant wrote an op-ed for The Guardian about being granted access to all that information, in particular, all the information Google had about him. And here's what he found. He wrote, to his surprise, your bookmarks, your emails, your contacts, your Google Drive files, your YouTube videos, the photos you've taken on your phone, data from your calendar, your Google Hangout sessions, your location history, down to how many steps you walk in a day. So any single company possessing this level of detail about us is, I think, for many, if not most of us, pretty upsetting, pretty alarming. But at the same time, I don't think most of us should be surprised, even though I think many of us are. I, for example, was reading this. We know that we give all of our data to companies like Google when we use them, and we use them all the time. In fact, from Alexa and Amazon to Apple Siri to Google's Assistant, we are really only entrusting these massive companies with more of our data and more personal data at that. And so the question, I think for us, for the folks that are bothered by this here today, the question is, why is the scope of this level of information so unsettling? And the answer, in my view, is it is unsettling because it represents a loss of agency. It is now entirely possible for these companies, based on the data we generate, to know more about ourselves as individuals than we do. We cannot store, we cannot harness all our own data as individuals. We can't do this computationally. We certainly can't do it mentally. Instead, our brains really use selective bits of data to create fictions that represent us and our world. In other words, to create our identities. And in that selection lies a choice, lies a sense of agency, lies a sense of freedom. But as we realize that other organizations can profile us better than we can understand, other organizations can make predictions about our preferences and our past and future activities better than we can, we are going to watch some semblance of our autonomy recede. I think we hand over, in some senses, our freedom in that our identities and our world become much less fluid. I also think it's worth highlighting that there's been a great deal of thought and scholarship on this, in particular from Shoshana Zuboff in her book, Surveillance Capitalism, which I think is great, but I also think that that school of thinking misses the broader point. The point is not simply that we are being mined as consumers and as individuals for our data, although that's certainly important. The point is that there are new ways to turn our data into insights, into deeply intimate insights and revelations about ourselves that we on our own cannot intuit, we cannot accomplish. And so I think the power of this type of data, the power of this data to do more than we were able to previously, I think is what impacts us the most. And in that sense, I think impinges on our agency. Okay, so those were the first 3 points. We live basically in a state of, I think, deep disorientation that is being brought about by the digitization of our everyday lives. This is so thorough, this digitization, it's so all-encompassing that in many respects, there is really nowhere to hide, hence the name of this talk, and hence the name of the white paper it's based upon. So what can we actively do? Or more constructively, what should we do? What do I recommend? I don't have all the answers, far from it. I work and I live and I breathe in this space. So I confess, I am probably best to look for the diagnosis and less for the treatment. But I do have 3 broad recommendations that I'd like to outline before we close this talk. So I'm going to start with what I really believe to be the most important takeaway, which in 2 words is slow down. I think at its core, all of our data privacy, all of our data security problems derive from the unprecedented rate at which we've embraced networked devices. For perspective, really no technology in human history has been adopted as fast as the internet. It took over 100 years after the invention of the telephone before its near universal adoption in the US. Analogous adoption timeframes followed for electricity and automobiles. Yet it's taken really only 1 decade for 4 in every 5 Americans to own a smartphone. And so if our major problems are being caused by the frantic pace at which we're all adopting network technology, and because of this, we're generating higher volumes of data in the process, slowing down this adoption, understanding our environment, is really what I contend is the first step towards a solution. Now, I'm not arguing, I'm not advocating for us to be basically to all go around trying to be Luddites. This is not, as William Buckley put it when describing conservatism, as an argument for standing athwart history and simply yelling stop. Instead, what does this actually mean? What can we do? And so I have 3 recommendations here. I think to start with is that laws need to mandate that any system with an IP address, which is a prerequisite for connecting to the internet, either have a finite lifetime or specifically accept updates. The list of devices that currently can't be updated when flaws are discovered is long, and it's growing longer. One example that I find quite troubling is that amongst all devices that used Google's Android operating system in 2016, a reported 29%, almost a third of all of those devices could not be patched. Second, liability for cybersecurity flaws needs to be made a lot more clear. Software makers need to be held to account. Currently, the biggest penalties for cybersecurity defects really relate to failures in reporting after breaches or misrepresentations in a product's terms of service. But the fact is that neither contributes to safer code. And instead, we need to clarify what constitutes minimum cybersecurity requirements, and we need to standardize liability when these benchmarks are broken. And I think this will in turn reduce the pace of adoption. It will cause vendors to slow down a process that up until now really prioritizes speed to market above all else. So last in the category of slow down, we have here analog alternatives, which is basically the need to preserve analog alternatives to digital capabilities. I think this is a moral imperative. I think this is an economic imperative. And this is a national security imperative, really all wrapped into one. And so basically, instead of focusing solely on securing digital systems, we also need to broaden our efforts to ensure that critical activities have alternate methods for operating if a cybersecurity flaw severs their access to the internet. I can't say at this moment every single analog system that we should preserve, But the point is that as we embrace new technologies, we cannot, or at least we should not, blindly replace all the systems they're meant to improve. You can think about something like cash, for example, which is being replaced basically by digital currency, digital units, with huge, I think, repercussions, especially repercussions on marginalized communities, which we can talk about later. Okay, so that was the slow down recommendation. I promised 2 more. Second, we need to, I think desperately, stop thinking about consent as something that's central to protecting our privacy. It is not, and it is becoming less meaningful every day. For perspective, almost all current privacy frameworks are really predicated in one way or another on user consent. That's why you have to agree to all the terms and conditions and cookie banners when you're browsing online. The basic idea is that users can, at the point when they hand over their data, meaningfully understand what it is they're trading it in for. Frankly, one of the central pillars of contract law. But the fact is that as it relates to our data, that is simply not true. The core value of machine learning applied against our data, as we talked about before, lies in its unpredictability. And as a result, true value can really only be recognized at scale and significantly at a later point in time. So what does this mean? It means we will never be fully able to understand what it is we are consenting to, and to reassert control over our data, which is, I would contend, the central aim of privacy. We need to think about this framework differently, about what it means to trade our data for any object of value. In my view, central to a more robust construct are purpose restrictions on data, setting basically what use cases certain data can and cannot be used for outside of any particular given transaction. The EU actually does a very good job with this in the GDPR. Their main quite stringent data regulation. The GDPR basically sets forth 6 and only 6 legal bases for processing. And this is something that basically is authorized. It's a positive right that derives from an area that is outside of the actual transaction. And what I'm suggesting is that we learn from this approach and we make purpose restrictions central to protecting our privacy. And so basically, to boil it down, if an organization doesn't know what the data is going to be used for, it should not be able to collect that data to begin with limited exemptions, irregardless of what the actual user thinks. Okay, last and third is our need for more data. Basically, if we can't understand our environment, we must do better to situate ourselves within it by gathering data in as close to real time as possible. Now, there's a default assumption in the world of data science that more data leads to better insights. That is not what I'm advocating. What I'm advocating, frankly, is the negative, which is that in this case, no data leads to no insights, which is where we all too frequently find ourselves. I think one of the futures that I'm quite worried about, in fact, a future that I think we're already entering, is one in which only the largest organizations, the Googles, the Apples, the Amazons of this world, can operate meaningfully in cyberspace because only they have access to a sufficient volume of data. And so to prevent that, I think we need to do a better job of facilitating access to data across organizations and across different environments. And so at the same time that data must be better protected, it also must be easier to access, which is a seeming paradox. There are technical solutions that actually make this problem less intractable than it seems. Specifically, there's a group of technologies called privacy enhancing technologies, or PETs, that facilitate the use of data while also inherently protecting its privacy and security. Ones that I would highlight in the family of PETs that I believe are kind of particularly consequential are differential privacy, federated learning, and synthetic data. And these types of technologies, I think, are a key to basically a future when data is able to be more protected and put to use intelligently and for all of us. Okay, so just to sum up, I think if I can leave you with any single takeaway from these points today, it is represented by this not so fantastic graphic here on the slide, but it is basically this, that traditional barriers and concepts like privacy and trust and identity and even contracts are eroding in the sense that they don't clearly and directly apply to the digital world that we increasingly inhabit. These old conceptions, I think, are in many cases collapsing under the weight of the changes that digital technologies have inflicted on our lives. Indeed, there's a concept known as perimeter collapse, which is what this graphic is meant to illustrate in the world of cybersecurity. And the basic point to perimeter collapse is that due to the complex mixture of all of the applications and software systems we're adopting, the idea of clear perimeters, of clear boundaries and walls, of the idea that inside this perimeter is my area and outside the perimeter is your area, is eroding. These concepts are eroding under the weight of all of these changes. But I would also contend that the fact is that these changes, the way they occur, the pace at which they occur, they are not fated to happen by any means. And indeed, they don't actually have to be negative or harmful. I think in many senses, they offer us an opportunity to rebuild and to reshape some of our most important ideas as they're applied to cyberspace and really as they're built into the very fabric of the digital world. So put simply, my points here today are not an argument for passivity. They're not arguments for watching and for waiting as the digital world completely overwhelms the physical one. Instead, I think we can and I think we must be proactive about all these changes. They're occurring because we're making a choice every day to adopt these technologies in specific ways. And what that really means is that there's nothing inevitable in the story I've outlined today. We can slow down. We can place intelligent, carefully written laws on the books to help us make sense of our digital environment, to help us assert control over our data, really to rebuild some of these past conceptions like privacy and like trust that are now under threat. We can preserve, I think, what we risk losing. The real question is what's stopping us. So with that question, I'd like to thank folks for coming to hear me talk. I will stop sharing my screen in a moment. If you'd like to reach out to me, my email is up on the screen, and the white paper that today's talk is based off of can be accessed via this URL. So I will stop sharing and thank you again.
Thank you, Andrew. Let me first, we already have a couple questions in the queue. Let me once again reiterate that you're all welcome to share more questions as those come to you. If I may use moderator prerogative to ask the first question though, before taking the questions from the queue. I will say that for the majority of your talk, I felt like you were toying with the idea of technological determinism. And I certainly was worried that this is where it was going, but then comes the other half where you suggest certain regulatory solutions. And the conclusion you said that we can, that it's not fated, I'm using your quotes now, and that it can be slowed down and through various regulatory solutions. But I am worried whether we're missing a key feature here, which has nothing to do with technology whatsoever and has everything to do with the markets. And so one thing that has not come up enough in your talk today, and I'd be curious to hear more about, is the way in which essentially a capitalist environment has allowed all of the story you're telling to go out of control, and whether or not we've reached a point where we are unable to restructure our market anymore to be able to address the concerns. And so no matter how many clear reliability rules we'll set up, or no matter how many data processing instructions someone in Europe will set up for Silicon Valley, the reality is that so long as we have a market that is radically built on aggregation of data and data as a resource and then making profit off of it, we are stuck to continue to relive this nightmare.
So I think a couple thoughts. The first that I want to highlight when I hear points that parallel the one you just made is that the markets are wonderful. Lots of really good things are happening. I skimmed over the good things because that wasn't the purpose of this talk. But I think as a whole, I think we would be very short-sighted to let the bad outweigh the good and not to realize how much value we've gotten and continue to extract from the digital world as we see today. In fact, Zoom, well, we can talk about Zoom later. We can actually talk about Zoom security flaws later. But the role of markets, and in fact, one of the books I have back here is from Michael Sandel on the moral limits of markets. And I think very frequently about the role of the limits of markets as they relate to cybersecurity. I think left alone, markets will not address this issue because, for a number of reasons, the easiest of which to describe is just the collective action problem of the incentive is time to market. How quickly can you get your product into market? And then out the product goes, and then people think about security later. To strike kind of a hopeful note, though, I think the suggestions that I made, in particular, I think much clearer liability for cybersecurity flaws, I think will have an enormous impact. And the fact is that right now, we've done a pretty poor job of regulating technology. I think you were talking about, I'll make one more point and then I'll just stop. You were talking about, I think, specifically the regulation of data and how it's used and how it's aggregated. And there has been, frankly, I think more on that than there has been on the actual regulation of software, like of software quality. But I think even there, I think we have basically doubled down on outmoded ways of thinking. And so part of the emphasis on consent is that the answer, it's kind of like the cowbell skit in SNL. It's like the answer to our problems is not emphasizing consent more, which is something that we kind of continue to see. So I think the real question is there a will to actually fix this problem? And if there's a will and there's a will to do it creatively, then I'm optimistic. Anyway, start off with a point of optimism, and hopefully that addressed your point.
Yeah, I'll just mention one follow up, which is that states like Indiana and Utah, we're in Indiana, so why not mention it, have tried to come up with ideas around cybersecurity safe havens where you won't be held liable. And in the Indiana Attorney General framework, they actually lay down here, if you meet ISO 27001, if you meet this or that, you will not be held liable in the case of a data breach. It's just, given the things that you described about trust being dead and supply chain attacks and so on, no one's guaranteeing that if Indiana's doing the right thing in setting up these cybersecurity standards, that anything necessarily will be solved by doing that. So that's what I meant by maybe we need a more radical restructuring of the markets, but I don't want to hog the conversation either. So, okay. So we have one question from Michael Crump, who is asking, is a radical change in terms and conditions or terms of service necessary from a consumer protection perspective in your mind?
It's radically changing I don't know. I'm thrown off by the word radical. I don't know. I don't know what that means. Is that like what's the scale? I think, I mean, terms and conditions are almost meaningless from a consumer perspective, in the sense that, like, there's a fiction that they're performing some actual contractual value. I don't know if anyone has ever seen someone not engage with a digital product because they didn't like some provision in the T's and C's on a consumer level. Like, tell me, I would love to meet this person. If that's exceedingly rare. By and large, they're just kind of shrink wrap agreements that nobody really has any control over. And the only actual kind of substantive, I think, changes that happen in T's and C's relates to either stuff going on with, like, signaling for regulators, and then the marketing campaigns. Like, I think Apple is engaged and has been engaged in this marketing and branding exercise to illustrate that you really can trust their digital ecosystem. And so I think that's what's going on with Apple. I don't know if that answered the question. Let me pause for a second, and Asaf or Michael, please feel free to weigh in and tell me if that addressed the question.
Well, Michael is more than open to saying a follow-up. I have some thoughts, but let's move to Levi's question, which is also it's multi-layered. So, but Levi asks, how do you envision practically democratizing data access for individuals? and then shifts gears to law enforcement in particular. What about law enforcement investigating cyber crimes? How do you protect the Fourth Amendment while also empowering law enforcement to improve attack attribution with necessary data or telemetry? Is attribution of cyber crimes still important as a deterrent to the theft of personally identifiable information? So in other ways, is there no, we usually talk about privacy versus security, but at times the trade-offs are different. And do you see any trade-offs in the way that you try to increase privacy, but ending up hurting it?
Yes, so there are a lot of different, I mean, I could go on for a long time. There are a lot of different questions embedded in there. So, okay, so practically, honestly, so the real core to all of these questions here from Levi is basically, I alluded to the way to get out of this paradox, which is to say protect data more and then also make it more available, which is to take lessons from things like HIPAA anonymization standards, in particular HIPAA's expert determination anonymization standard. I think is extremely, extremely useful. And in fact, in the EU, there's this really critical, really frankly overlooked debate going on between the data protection authorities on the one hand, and then the actual medical authorities on the other. I favor the medical authorities because you have the data protection authorities that are saying basically shut it down. Like anytime someone needs to access or use data, you have to have kind of black and white safeguards that are binary and very clear. On the other hand, you have the medical community, which actually has been doing a very decent job of protecting and utilizing data for many decades. And I think that we can learn a lot from them. And in particular, the takeaway that I tend to call it, and other researchers I work with, functional anonymization, which there's no such thing as true anonymization. I think as soon as you're even having the discussion, is it possible to anonymize data? You've lost, because that discussion is one that is so binary that like you're kind of destined not to go anywhere fruitful. The real question is, what are the levels of risk that we can tolerate from a functional level that will allow us to protect that data and also get value out of it? So there is certainly a trade-off related to privacy and security, or privacy and utility. But I think there are a lot of things we can do to actually make that trade-off intelligently. Doesn't mean breaches aren't going to happen. It doesn't mean that all data will be 100% protected. But if you look actually at the medical community, I've been trying actually for many years to find an example of the HIPAA anonymization standard, like a breach occurring under the HIPAA anonymization standard in the US. I haven't been able to find one. I don't know why. It could be because it just happens and then it gets settled. But I can't find one. And I think that's a testament to the fact that basically if we change our standards and we also think about the use of technologies, anonymization technologies, I can go on about expert determination at great length, particularly if it would be helpful to provide kind of background on it. But I think that's the type of answer we want. And so I think what I want, and I used to work in law enforcement, is if a law enforcement agency wants access to data, the first type of data I want them to have access to is one that has been functionally anonymized, so that it would be very difficult for them to directly connect any of that data to any individual. And then as kind of the identifiability level increases, I want the amount of oversight that law enforcement has to increase as well. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, I have a quick follow-up on that, which is we've been talking about a bunch of different existing regulations from the GDPR to HIPAA and so on. And I'm curious, how do you address the unterritorial nature of the subject matter that is the subject of regulation, and who should be the entity that engages in putting forward the slow down, stop relying on consent regulations that you're suggesting here? And can we really conceive of all countries operating together in trying to resolve these? And is it not one of those cases where if there's a weakest link here, all of us will collapse?
I think it's honestly, it's the reverse in my experience. What companies do, I mean, there are so many ironies. The largest companies tend to just default to the highest standard because it would be too cost ineffective for them to have to grant exceptions on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis. So by and large, that's what I tend to see. I should say there's a level of enthusiasm and faith that might be a little bit higher in the actual jurisdictions that are enforcing the regulations. But by and large, if you're a global company, you just pick the standard that is the most intense, and then you try to apply it everywhere. I think that's why you have this very bizarre situation politically, where you have all these major technology companies that are actively lobbying for very stringent regulations, because it's the most cost efficient way for them is just tell us what we need to do, make it clear, we'll do it, and then we'll move on. I should highlight that again. I'm a big fan of sector by sector solutions. I'm a big fan of solutions, regulatory solutions that where the oversight burden scales with resources available. Because I think, frankly, I think what the GDPR has done unintentionally is encourage monopolies. And I'm worried by that, because again, these larger technology companies, they don't have a big problem with regulation because they can afford it. They have teams of lawyers, as smart as many of the folks that are on this call, who can help them figure all this stuff out. It's the much smaller companies that I'm more concerned about. And so I think the balance we want is to enable the smaller companies to do this without having to give all their money to lawyers like us.
But can I say, this race to the top you're describing doesn't solve necessarily what Kate Klonick in a future paper is calling a democratic deficit, in the sense that who placed the European Data Protection Authority at the helm of setting up these standards for the rest of us, in the same way that before Europeans were unhappy with the Americans setting the standards for the rest of us. And so there is still a question of who should be the one regulating.
It is not fair, and I don't think that they're best positioned to do it. So it might be a race to the top in some weird sense, and I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. I mean, we see technology companies with some regularity threaten to leave jurisdictions. It's happening with Google in Australia. So I don't know. I don't know where it's headed. That's certainly a problem. At the same time, I don't know. I don't know if it would be realistic to pin all our faith in an organization like the UN to fix this. Actually, on the UN, while I'm kind of digging at the UN, the UN released one of my favorite reports on privacy enhancing technologies by any organization. And I was surprised to see it coming from, of all places, like the UN. But it's a good sign. So the answer is I don't know. I'm a big fan of regulatory federalism because of the flexibility. But you're right. There's certainly this. It used to be like Sacramento was where all the technology companies were worried about regulation impacting them. Now it's Brussels. What stops Beijing or Moscow or I don't know. Pick a city. I mean, maybe DC next. So I don't know. It's a problem. And I found. I don't know. I guess we're nearing the end here, but I found that almost all legal conversations I engage in, at the end, someone says it's a collective action problem, and everybody shrugs. So that might be where we ended up unintentionally.
I see Scott showing. Are we at the time? You're yeah.
Unfortunately, Asif, I wish we had more time, because this is fantastic. And per usual, Andrew, you've teed up a number of fantastic questions that we'll have to continue discussing in the future, including during our next session, which is going to be interesting with Chris Painter, one of the foremost and first cyber diplomats in the world. So focus more there on the international cyber norms dimension, but certainly with overlap with our points here. So perhaps we could just, everyone virtually from your offices and homes, join us in thanking Andrew and Asif as well. Great moderating, great presentation, Andrew. Thank you so much for making the time. We really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Absolutely. No, it's a pleasure. And we'll make sure to get the link over to you as soon as it's archived and ready to go. So thank you for participating. Thanks all for joining us, and see you next time with Chris Painter later this month.